The second and final video for chapter 6. So we were just talking about pay and how you kind of determine your compensation strategy for different levels. So we did so now we're going to go into the base pay strategy. So this gets down more into what is the base pay for different kinds of employees in our organization. And base pay is the pay that people are taking home, like they know they're going to get the same check, for example, every single pay period. Um, you can think about this, and again, this is because our book is from an economist, as like market value versus use value. Market value is what is the market paying for this position in terms of base pay, but use value is more internal. What is the use of this specific job role for the organization? And that's considering the organization's mission and the core work that it does. Based on that as well, we already talked about some ways, some reasons you might use market pricing versus internal structures for your pay. You might also have market pricing versus kind of internal pricing, dependent on this market value versus use value as well. I'm going to do a few more slides about internal pricing. We'll get more into it later in the semester, but I feel like to understand some of the concepts, we need a basic sense of that. But essentially for internal pricing, we're building a hierarchy and then pricing our benchmark jobs. We're creating broad bands or we're banding those jobs. And then we might have job families where there's different bands for different kinds of jobs. They go into different bands on the salary structure. We also have to think about for base pay, what are we paying for? Traditionally, it's been a job, and in a lot of places, it will still be a job. But in some places, or for some jobs, especially higher up in the organization, or when the core work of specific employees is related to what the organization does or its strategy, we might pay more for performance or for the person. The person might have specific skills that we'll pay for, and we'll pay for them to develop those skills or develop additional skills. For performance, it's how well they're performing in the job role that they're given, but that job role can be changing from year to year as well, or even faster than that. We also want to think about our pay differential. How different is the pay within our organization for different groups of employees or different kinds of employees? One issue that we're having in a lot of organizations now is that we're creating very large pay differentials sometimes where we have these well-paid permanent employees with really good benefits. A lot of them are upper leadership, but they could also be people like professionals like engineers or people like myself who have PhDs, for example, for very specific jobs. That's one group of people, and hopefully most of you will be in that group. But there's also a lot of times in some of these organizations, peripheral employees who are temporary, they have part-time jobs, so they're not eligible for benefits, and they're much more poorly paid. You can think about this in a lot of organizations. Administrative assistants could be this kind of job. Sometimes they're considered more professional, sometimes they're more entry-level job. People like maintenance staff could be like this, customer service employees. I'm thinking like retail, for example. Sometimes your store leadership might be paid pretty well, but the people like the entry level employees, a lot of them are working part-time and they're working at minimum wage or just above minimum wage. That's where that pay differential comes into play. So let me tell you a little bit more about how we do internal pricing. Again, we'll get into this more in this semester, but when we use internal data, meaning internal data means the data the organization has about who is in that organization, what they do, and what they're already paid. We focus in on the value of the job to the organization. So we do include market pricing, and I'll talk about where, but our actual focus is really where in this organization does this job fit compared to all the others, and considering what we do as an organization and our competitive advantage within our market. Our job structure then is built by analyzing and evaluating all the jobs and putting them into a hierarchy. The job analysis is analyzing the work that the tasks that each of those jobs has, and then job evaluation is making that hierarchy. Where do these jobs fit, or the people who do these tasks, where would they fit based on the job roles or the job descriptions we have now within this hierarchy in our organization? We would group jobs according to their relative value. So it's not like in some organizations that are really small, you might not have job groups because you don't need them. Maybe you only have 10 or 15 employees. You can rank all of those employees in their jobs, the tasks they do as part of their job role into a hierarchy pretty easily. But when you're in a larger organization, say something like a Kansas State University, you're going to have to group jobs. You're almost always going to have to group jobs because there's just too many jobs to make a hierarchy otherwise. But also within those job groups, then you can make sure that the pay is very fair and you can look at different aspects of pay within those job groups, especially when the job groups might be paid quite differently. So when I'm saying Kansas State University, professors with PhDs might be in one job group, instructors that don't have a PhD might be in another group, and partially that will be because the educational differences in those groups lead to different, very different market values for those groups. And so you have to consider that if you put them into job groups, that makes it easier to make those differences within your compensation system and then to explain them as well to employees. Within each of those job groups, then you have a benchmark job. A benchmark job may not be the highest paying job, but it's like the most common job that you can find in other organizations. So something like assistant professor, which is someone who just got their PhD. Usually, it doesn't always have to be this kind of person. And then they're starting in a job where they do research and teaching. That might be a benchmark job for people or professors with PhDs, for example. Then you would take that job and then you would go and find out what are other organizations in your industry paying for that kind of job. Or if there's not an exact one-to-one match on jobs, something very similar to that. And then you take that information back and you use those benchmark jobs, the pay that they get in the market, to set the pay within those job groups. And within the job groups, you can have like a hierarchy of who goes in what order in that job group, and you base how much each of those different jobs is paid based on those benchmark jobs and the market price for those benchmark jobs. So there is some market pricing included in the internal pricing, but a lot of the organization of the salary structure is really based on what the job does and how it affects the core work of the organization. Another concept they talk a lot about but don't explain very well in these chapters is broadbanding. So I got this picture from the I think it's called the Association of Innovation in Higher in Human Resource or Human Resources. I've never heard of this organization, but they had some really good explanations online. So if you want to check them out, there's a few concepts from this week that I found some really good explanations and good graphics for. So I'm using them here just to give you an idea of what some of these concepts mean. So on the left, we have our traditional salary structure. And you can see in the salary structure, for example, we have three groups of pay. These groups might be job groups. They could also be different jobs within the same job group. Let's imagine they're job groups at this point. So in the first job group, the pay goes from 40,000 to 52,000. And the next one, it's 45 to 58. And then the third one is 50 to 65,000. What happens then is for employees to move up within this traditional salary structure, they'll get yearly increases potentially. In the past, it used to be based more on seniority. Now it's more on performance or skills. And sometimes there's a cost of living adjustment as well. But in order to change from, say, the first group to the second group, you will have to get promoted. But once you're promoted, you're into the second group. And now your manager has to determine your pay. That's why promotions often get pay increases, especially traditionally, because you used to go into a different pay category within the salary structure. In the last, I would say, a couple decades, broadbanding has become more popular. And what broadbanding does is it squishes all of those groups together into one kind of band. And you would have several of these bands, but instead of having like 10, 15, 20 bands across your organization, you might only have 3 to 5 in broadbanding. And then what happens is your employees can get promoted, but they don't change their band that they're in for pay. So it's much easier for managers then to determine what your pay would be when you get promoted based on where you are in that broadband. In both of these, theoretically, people who are on the lower end of the pay in the band are people who are newer to that position and don't have as much seniority or experience. And then the longer you're in that organization, the higher you can go up into that band. One problem with the traditional salary structure was if you had people who were sticking around in their jobs because this was common, a few decades ago, you'd stay there for your whole career. You could have started out at $40,000 and not really gotten promoted because you didn't get the skills or you didn't have the educational experience to get promoted to a new position. But eventually you max out in your band before you're even done with your career. And then managers are really, their hands are tied in terms of using pay to keep you motivated or to keep you within the job. With broadbanding, we can avoid this problem because even if you started out at $40,000 and you don't get promoted, even if you were giving people increases simply because they increased their skills, or some organizations still give increases for seniority, you have a much higher kind of ceiling for pay at $65,000, where employees don't have to worry about, will I keep getting pay increases? They're not going to max out in their band because the band is so much broader. So that's why we do a lot of broadbanding. It leads to easier decision making for managers. It also means that employees, they have a lot more room to grow within the compensation structure, the salary structure in the organization. Variable pay is also something we have to consider. Traditionally, variable pay was reserved for only certain positions, like sales professionals that would get compensated for every sale they made. Some production employees that might have been compensated for every gadget they made, for example, and then top management, where it was based on performance numbers for the organization. But variable pay is now becoming much more common for lots of different kinds of employees. These will be things like merit pay programs, for example, that some of you have maybe experienced or will in your jobs. But you have to figure out, one of the decisions in your salary structure is figuring out who is included in a variable pay program. And one thing that you want to keep in mind, if you're putting people into variable pay programs, you have to determine what proportion of their pay will be base pay versus variable pay, and especially based on how much they control that variable pay. If you increase the variable pay for an employee, if we imagine, for example, organizations only have so much money to pay for each job role, if you increase the variable pay, that means you have to decrease usually the base pay if you have, that a limited amount of money to pay for a specific job role. That puts more risk on the employee because they could have a lower wage level simply from the variable pay. Their performance maybe didn't meet standards, whatever that performance metric was. For the organization, that can mean lower wages paid out because the variable pay will not be high, will not be as high for some employees as it will be for others. Versus base pay, where you've already guaranteed people a certain amount of money, and that's just money that you can never, it doesn't vary. So once you've committed to that, that's what you have to pay your employees. Some organizations see variable pay as an add-on. So you get a big base pay, and then the variable pay is simply because the organization has done well, or the individual has done well compared to maybe others in the organization. When organizations have this view of variable pay as an add-on, it's because they understand that when the economy changes, when forces outside of the organization change, it changes how much variable pay employees can actually earn. And employees should not be punished because, for example, we might be in a recession and they did a really great job, but we just don't have as much money to pay them for variable pay. You also have to figure out what level of performance you want to measure for the variable pay. Some of this will be determined based on what people do, the job roles, and how easy it is to measure what they actually do in their jobs. And some of it will be in the way that the work is structured in the organization. You would use individual variable pay if you have ways to determine individual performance. This could be through job performance evaluations that supervisors do. It could be through like our traditional jobs that had this for sales, you know exactly how many sales someone made, or for production employees, you would know how many things they produced. If your group, if a lot of the work is in teams, you may want to consider doing team performance, especially if you can measure team performance through like customer satisfaction or client satisfaction, through the number of things that a team has made or services they provided and that sort of thing. And then some organizations do organization level variable performance. So when the organization's revenues are good, or they're making a lot of profit, or they've saved on costs, they'll pass that on to their employees. Individual is easier for employees to understand how their variable pay will be calculated and understand their contribution to that variable pay. The higher up you go in the organization, even when you get to organization level measures, it's harder for employees to understand how their job and what they do specifically is contributing to the organization's performance. And so the variable pay is not as directly tied to their jobs, and it may not be as motivating for employees, especially if they can never make that connection between what they do and the organization's performance. We also have to think about benefits. The cost of benefits are rising faster than inflation. This one's probably easy for you to see if you read the news, and you could see healthcare costs go up often by double digits many years, even though inflation's not that high. What most organizations do, and this is not a term that's in the chapter that I do want you to know, is that they offer cafeteria plans. And a cafeteria plan in terms of benefits is when you provide a lot of different benefits for employees to choose from, and then you usually give them like a price cap that they can't go above. So they can choose, health insurance. Maybe they want life insurance. Maybe they want a retirement plan. You provide all of these, and they choose the ones that they want. It also means that they can change them from year to year, which can be helpful as their life situations change too. But we also have to think about cost control measures, and this is actually a big job of HR working with companies that provide a lot of these benefits. How can you control the costs from year to year if the costs are increasing faster than inflation? One is that you can change or reduce benefits. A lot of employers are doing this, so they might change, for example, their healthcare plan so that it covers fewer drugs or fewer operations or fewer other medical procedures that you might have done. They also might reduce the benefit in terms of how much it like is covered. So maybe the max goes down and that sort of thing. For healthcare, a really common strategy is cost sharing, where you just put more and more of the cost onto the employee, and the employer pays a smaller share each year, or they pay the same share, but the proportion of that cost, it keeps increasing for the employee to pay for. You can also reduce administrative costs. You can simplify programs. So instead of giving, like 10 different healthcare programs or options, you might have two, and people can only choose between those two. You can also combine benefits. So there may be benefits where you could combine life insurance with health insurance. That's not a common one, but I was just thinking, for example, a lot of um, organizations have gone from they used to separate vacation pay from sick pay, and now it's all just paid time off, PTO. And that is one way that you can reduce administrative costs because you just have one thing you have to measure, and you don't always need the documentation then for people to be sick, depending on what your rules are in your organization when it's just paid time off. You can also outsource benefits. I think a lot of you, if you work in HR, you will be working with a lot of companies outside of your company that are managing a lot of the benefits that you provide, partially because those companies have an expertise, but partially because of that expertise, it's much cheaper for them to manage than for you as HR to be managing some of these benefits.